Dawn had not yet touched the Valley of Albulena, yet the ground was already stained red like a waking nightmare. Hundreds of Ottoman soldiers were crushed beneath boulders, weighing tons that crashed down from the cliffs. With the force of falling thunder, a surviving horse writhed on the ground, its legs snapped in two, its eyes wide with terror. Nearby, hidden pits swallowed entire clusters of men, the crack of breaking bones echoing across the valley with a chilling sharpness. All of it happened within the first few minutes, before a single hand even reached for a sword. More than 2,000 men were erased from the earth in the opening strike. The most unsettling part was that this was the mild beginning. By the end of this video, you will understand how 8,000 men destroyed an army of 40,000. How an entire mountain was transformed into a ruthless killing engine. Why the conqueror of Constantinople himself fell silent at the news of this defeat, and what made Albulena the most perfectly executed ambush in medieval Europe. If this was only the first moment of the battle, you can imagine what waited beyond it. Fog covered the valley like a white shroud. No birds stirred, no wind moved, nothing hinted at life. The silence felt heavy, as if the land had already chosen the dead it would claim. Through that fog, shadows began to form. 40,000 Ottoman soldiers advanced, their armor cold and gleaming, their formations stretching so far that the rear ranks faded into the haze. They marched with the confidence of men certain that victory was already theirs. They had no idea that above them, hidden among stone and pine, 8,000 Albanian warriors watched in absolute stillness. No shifting feet, no whispered breath. Only the patient focus of men, waiting for one precise moment. The moment that would decide the fate of an entire army. To understand why 40,000 Ottoman soldiers marched straight into a perfect trap, we have to return to the years when Albania survived by a single thread. In the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Empire expanded like a tide of iron sweeping across Europe. From Constantinople to the Balkan Mountains, proud fortresses fell within days. The banners of ancient kingdoms were torn from their towers and thrown into the dirt like scraps of cloth. And standing directly in the path of that unstoppable surge was Albania, a land so small that many did not even consider it a country. Its size, however, was exactly what made it a target the empire intended to wipe out last. Year after year, the Albanian people lived like shadows. Homes were burned to ash. Harvests were stolen before they ripened. Entire villages disappeared from the map overnight. Allies who once offered support Venice, Naples extended weak hands, hesitated, then withdrew. No one wanted to stand beside a nation gasping for air. If Albania was a candle in a storm, it had been reduced to a single flickering flame. And that flame carried a name, Skanderbeg. He had once been trained by the Ottomans themselves, honored with the title Skanderbeg, meaning their own Alexander. Yet he abandoned the empire, abandoned its court and its power, and returned home to raise the black double-headed eagle, declaring that this small nation would not kneel. For 20 years he fought without rest, 20 years of a single man leading a tiny country against the strongest empire in Europe. But even legends have limits. Albania's strength drained away, its armies thinned, its granaries stood empty. The spirit of its people wavered until even a whisper of bad news felt strong enough to break them. In the dim taverns of the Balkans, men leaned close and murmured words they feared to speak aloud. Maybe this time we will not survive. Yet what dragged Albania to the edge of despair was not the Ottoman sword or the weight of its armies. It was something far more devastating, a knife that came from the one place no one expected. From the very man Skanderbeg had loved and trusted as his own blood. In every war, the most dangerous enemy is not the one standing in front of you with a raised sword. It is the one behind you, smiling with the trust you once placed in them. For Skanderbeg, that person was Hamza Kestrioti. Hamza was not an obscure officer pulled from a distant border. He was family. He was the child Skanderbeg had raised as his own son. Skanderbeg gave him armor, gave him a sword, gave him command, and gave him every privilege a young warrior could dream of. Above all, he gave Hamza the kind of trust that only blood can grant. But the Ottomans understood something empires throughout history have used to break the unbreakable. If you want to topple a house, strike the pillar that holds it up. They did not need an army to wound Skanderbeg. They only needed a promise. For an ambitious young man like Hamza, those promises were blinding. a title in the imperial court, glory that would make men kneel in respect, gold heavy enough to bend the wrists that carried it, placed beside Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had shaken all of Europe. Under a moonless sky, Hamza made his choice. It was sharper and colder than any blade. He betrayed Skanderbeg. He did not simply abandon Albania. He did not simply kneel beneath the Ottoman banner. He accepted a mission that chilled the mountain stone itself. Return home, extinguish the rebellion, and deliver the head of the very man who had raised him. The consequences struck faster than any battle. Skanderbeg was lured into a trap at Berat, a trap set by the same hands he once trusted. The Albanian army shattered. Countless warriors fell. The spirit of the nation dropped to its lowest point in 2 decades of resistance. In the cold taverns of the Balkans, men whispered as if afraid the mountains might hear them. Skanderbeg is finished. Albania is done. Even his own blood has abandoned him. They were wrong. Completely wrong. Defeat did not break Skanderbeg. It made him silent. And within that silence, something new began to form, slow and dangerous. A plan sharper than any sword, and deadlier than any marching army. A plan Hamza would answer for. A plan 40,000 Ottoman soldiers would answer for. If you are still watching at this point, you are clearly someone who values the heavy moments of history. So hit like, leave a comment so I know you're following the story, and subscribe to the channel. There are many battles that deserve to be told the right way. After the defeat at Berat, the Balkans whispered that Skanderbeg was finished. To them, a hero struck down by betrayal was nothing more than a tired shadow of the man he once was. What they did not understand was that some lions roar when wounded, and some lions turn silent. They turn silent until the moment they are ready to tear apart the one who dared draw their blood. For the next 2 years, Skanderbeg vanished from every battlefield. No skirmishes, no counterattacks. No signs that Albania still had the strength to resist an empire that grew larger by the hour. To the Ottomans, that silence signaled collapse. To the Albanian villagers, it felt like the entire nation was holding a single desperate breath. But for Skanderbeg, those 2 years were not retreat. They were preparation. Deep within the Mat Mountains, he rebuilt his forces from the remnants left after Berat. Farmers with trembling hands but unbroken eyes. Blacksmiths who hammered iron until their palms tore. Surviving soldiers who carried wounds that had not yet healed, and dreams that refused to die. They were few, but each one held something the Ottomans could not see from the outside. The hardness of a people who had risen from their own ashes more times than they could count. Time moved slowly, like stone wearing down under constant wind. Albania looked like a dead land, with no drums, no horses, no training grounds, nothing to suggest an army still existed. Yet beneath that quiet layer of ash, a small flame was spreading. No one noticed it. No one saw it. No one imagined what was coming. Then one morning, the news swept across the mountain passes from Macedonia. Sultan Mehmed II had launched a new campaign. Larger, faster, harsher. Leading it was Hamza, the traitor who now carried both imperial authority and personal hatred. 40,000 soldiers marched north like a river of steel, guided by the same man who once called Skanderbeg uncle. When the message reached the fortress of Kruju, Skanderbeg did not slam his fist. He did not shout orders. He walked out to the cold balcony and watched the gray clouds sliding across the ridge like funeral banners. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm enough to be mistaken for the wind. If war seeks us, then the mountains will answer. From that moment, he began searching for the place where the mountains would speak. He rode along hidden paths, known only to locals. He placed his hands on sheer cliff faces to feel the pulse of the stone. He studied narrow gorges dark enough to resemble the throat of a sleeping beast. Day after day he searched for something no sword could provide, until he stood before a narrow valley locked between 2 walls of rock rising like a pair of giant blades. A place where a large army could not spread its lines. A place where sound traveled far and falling stone needed only the slightest touch. A place where once entered no one could turn back. Skanderbeg looked into the silent valley. His eyes closed for a moment, as if he were listening to the mountain's answer. Then he spoke with absolute certainty. This is where we end it. It was no longer a battlefield. It was an execution ground. When Skanderbeg chose Albulena, he did not choose a battlefield. He He chose a death sentence. From that moment, the mountain began to wake. No commands were shouted, no speeches were needed. Everyone understood that once Skanderbeg stepped into the valley, they were no longer preparing for a fight. They were preparing for an execution. The men of Albania, farmers, blacksmiths, horsemen, survivors of Berat, became the hands of nature itself. They worked in a silence so complete it felt unnatural. No fires, no loud voices, not even a footprint left on the soft earth. The horses' muzzles were wrapped to prevent a single startled cry in the middle of the night. They dug deep pits and covered them with soil and dry leaves, turning the ground into black jaws ready to swallow anything that stepped on them. They hid massive tree trunks along the slopes, bound with leather straps stretched so tight that one swing of a blade would send tons of wood crashing down like a stampede of iron beasts. They stacked heavy stones into precarious shelves, ready to collapse into roaring avalanches with nothing more than a push. The blacksmiths reopened their forges and hammered iron until their palms split. The ringing metal echoed through the night like the heartbeat of the valley, growing faster with each passing hour. Priests moved through the ranks, placing a hand on each warrior's forehead. They said nothing, yet their faces carried the truth. This was not a battle. This was the last chance their country would ever have. Women carried hard bread, salt, and strong wine into the woods, set them down quietly, and disappeared before dawn. Children were led deep into the mountains where the sound of battle and dying men would never reach them. It felt as if all of Albania was holding its breath. As if nature sided with them, the fog thickened beyond anything the elders had seen, clung to the earth, hiding every trace, turning the valley into a stage frozen by an invisible hand just hours before judgment, day after day. The trap grew sharper. It could not be seen from afar. It could not be guessed, could not be escaped. All it required was for 40,000 Ottoman soldiers to march far enough in. Once they did, the great creature of stone and timber that Albania had been secretly constructing would close around them like the jaws of an ancient beast. When everything was ready, Skanderbeg stood on the highest ridge and looked down at the mist-filled valley. He placed his hand on the cold stone beside him and spoke softly, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. Let them enter, as deep as they can, because once the Ottoman column advanced into the exact point he needed, once the wheels of their heavy wagons sank into the softened ground, once thousands of boots stepped onto the traps crafted beneath their feet, the valley itself would lock shut. No miracles required, no luck needed, only one more step. The moment that step landed, there would be no way out for any of them. When the Ottoman army marched into Albulena, they had no idea they were walking into the slowly tightening jaws of a stone giant. That morning the valley was covered in ordinary Balkan fog. Nothing looked dangerous, no enemy in sight. And that was the most dangerous sign of all. 40,000 soldiers, cavalry, archers, infantry, artillery crews, supply wagons, stretched out like a massive steel serpent sliding between two walls of rock. Armor clattered, hooves pounded the ground. Officers joked and laughed. Every sound bounced between the cliffs, echoing until it felt larger than the army itself. They advanced with the familiar confidence of men who believed themselves untouchable. But then the small details began to unsettle a few of them. One officer looked up. Strange. Not a single bird. Another frowned. Where's the wind? This valley always has wind. Their concerns disappeared as quickly as they surfaced. Pride drowned everything. Soldiers who had watched enemies flee at the mere sight of them seldom noticed warning signs. Only Hamza noticed. The traitor felt something wrong in the air. His eyes kept drifting to the cliffs, then to the soft ground beneath the horses. Something tugged at his instincts like a distant alarm. Yet behind him stretched a column miles long. A force that size could not stop, certainly could not turn around. The vanguard was already deep inside the valley while the rear was still outside its mouth. The entire army was stretched thin like a rope ready to snap. And once the front advanced too far, even Hamza knew there would be no way out. He tightened his grip on the reins and drew breath to order a halt. He never finished the word. A thunderous crash erupted behind them, and the ground trembled like a waking beast. Stones shattered loose from the slopes and roared downward, sealing the path they had just marched through. Trees toppled in sweeping arcs, smashing men and wagons beneath their weight. The rear ranks were crushed before they understood what was happening. The soldiers at the front kept marching. The soldiers at the back were already trapped. In a single frozen second, all 40,000 understood a horrifying truth. They were locked inside a giant stone box. Too narrow to spread out, too long to carry orders across, too tight to turn around. No room to maneuver, no visibility, no escape. Only a suffocating silence stretching on like a held breath. And in that moment, when fear clamped down on the heart of the Ottoman army, Skanderbeg knew the trap had snapped shut exactly as he intended. The moment the path behind them was sealed, the Valley of Albulena came alive. It began as a thin hiss, slicing through the air like a blade, then another, then hundreds, then thousands. In seconds, the sky turned into a churning black storm. Arrows crashed down on the Ottoman ranks like a waterfall. The sound of shafts striking armor rang out like stones punching metal. When they hit flesh, the noise shifted into something soft and horrifying. The soldiers in the front line had no time to understand what was happening before the ground beneath them split open. Hidden pits tore wide, swallowing men and horses in an explosion of screaming chaos. The Ottoman cavalry, the force that once crushed half of Europe, was now worthless. Their horses could not turn in the narrow gorge, could not charge, could not escape. They were trapped like breathing slabs of meat, perfect targets for the Albanian archers stationed high above. Each arrow meant a gasp, a body tumbling from the saddle, a new patch of blood spreading across the dirt. From the left side of the valley, a streak of movement cut through the fog. Albanian horsemen burst downhill, appearing like ghosts, striking once, twice, then vanishing before the Ottomans even lifted their shields. They did not attack to kill. They attacked to break minds, to make the enemy fear every shadow and doubt every breath. Hamza shouted until his throat burned, trying to steady the troops, rebuild the lines, restore any sense of order. The valley made that impossible. The men in front trampled those behind. The soldiers in the rear pushed forward in panic. 40,000 bodies crushed against each other, breaking their own formation long before the Albanians touched them. No commander on earth could control a panicked human tidal wave inside a stone funnel. That was the moment Skanderbeg unleashed the second strike. From both slopes, long ranks of Albanian cavalry and infantry charged downward. Their war cries shook the valley like the roar of the mountain itself. They did not run. Poured down like a collapsing river. Spears tore into the Ottoman flank from the right. Blades carved across from the left. Boulders rained down from above, smashing into skulls, shoulders, and spines, turning every step of ground into a grinding millstone. There was no front line. There was no formation. There was no distinction between vanguard or rear. Everything dissolved into chaos. Blood soaked the mud. Smoke drifted between bodies. Horses reared and crashed onto men who could not move. Metal shrieked against metal. Stones shattered against shields. The air filled with the smell of burnt leather, torn flesh, and wet earth. A soldier only needed to slip once to be crushed under a stampede of terrified feet. Hamza rallied the best soldiers he could find and hacked a narrow corridor toward the north. For a single moment, only a heartbeat long, it looked as if he might break free. The Ottoman green banner rose above the press of bodies like a desperate flare. Then a sound fell from the mountaintop, a single deep strike, the kind of sound that feels like a hand closing around your throat. Tongue. It was Skanderbeg's final signal. From behind the fog, the last Albanian reserve the warriors saved for this precise instant charged down the slope like a falling hammer. They slammed into the Ottoman ranks and split them in two, sealing the jaws of the stone beast Albania had built to devour 40,000 men. The sky darkened. Rain began to fall, mixing blood with mud, yet steel continued to ring in the darkness. Night pulled its heavy curtain over the valley, but the battle refused to die. Because in that darkness, something even more terrifying was preparing to arrive. Night fell over Albulena, but it did not bring rest. It brought only darkness, thick and cold and heavy like a shroud pulled over a wound that refused to close. Rain hammered the valley through the night, not the gentle rain of the mountains, but a heavy downpour mixed with the smell of blood, gun smoke, and soil, churned open to its core. In that darkness, every boundary disappeared. Soldiers no longer knew who was friend or foe. Only shadows moved through the mud, sometimes flashing with a quick glint of steel before vanishing again, as if even the light was afraid to look too closely. Muffled cries rose into the air thick with rain and smoke, then died before they reached the cliffs. Skanderbeg moved through that night, armor-soaked, shoulders bent under the weight of a nation. He did not shout orders or drive his men forward. He listened. He listened to the ragged breathing of men about to fall. He listened to the distant clash of metal. He listened to the battlefield itself, tightening like a chest struggling for its final breath. He waited for the exact moment to end it. Hamza fought a different battle. Trapped in a sea of chaos, he tried to stay upright on ground, slick as watered blood. His armor dragged him down as if the mud were trying to swallow him whole. He pushed through bodies, tried to rally soldiers, tried to carve a path out before panic swallowed every trace of discipline. But the valley offered him nothing. A trap once closed does not open again. Around midnight, the rain stopped. In its place came a strange silence. Not the silence of nature resting, but the silence of a battle that had reached the very edge. The moment where both armies were so exhausted that breathing sounded louder than steel, that was when Skanderbeg gave the order. From the slopes, hundreds of torches burst into flame at once. For a moment, it looked as if the entire valley had ignited. Albanian warriors charged downhill like blazing specters, water exploding beneath their feet, fire reflecting off their helmets in jagged shapes that made them look less like men and more like the mountain itself, striking back in fury. The sudden light stunned the Ottomans, their eyes ruined by hours of darkness. Horses screamed, ranks shattered. The green banners were trampled into the mud and disappeared beneath the weight of bodies. Hamza shouted for a southern retreat, for a regrouping, for anything that resembled control. But every path was blocked by mud, collapsed pits, and fallen trunks. The very things Albania had spent months preparing. Steel clashed against steel, echoing across the cliffs without end. Yet, like every battle ever fought in history, the screams and the clamor eventually began to fade. At some unknown moment one no witness could later recall, the chaos gave way to stillness, not because of mercy, not because of peace, but because there was nothing left to fight. When the sun rose, its pale gold light stretched across a valley drowned in mist. The soil was so soft that every step sank into blood-thick mud. Streams running down the rocks carried a deep red tint. Not a single crow arrived before dawn, as if even scavengers feared this kind of silence. Skanderbeg dismounted. He looked over the valley that had become a colossal killing machine. No one cheered. No one lifted a sword. No one had the strength or the desire to celebrate. Only a quiet truth remained, steady as the first breath of morning. Albania, a small nation many believed erased from the map, had survived one more day. The news swept across Europe like winter wind through church doors. Venice rang its bells. Rome prayed. Naples recited verses about the Black Eagle standing against the eastern storm. But in Constantinople, behind cold marble walls, Sultan Mehmed II heard the report and stood silent for hours. No shouting, no rage, only silence. The silence of a man who understood that this scar would never fade. When the final threads of morning light touched Albulena, they did not shine on victory. They revealed what remained after a night in which men and mountains had torn each other open. Mud. Bodies carried away by floodwater, the survivors standing motionless like statues still trapped between terror and relief. The valley, despite all its destruction, held a strange kind of calm, as if nature was whispering something to anyone patient enough to listen. Skanderbeg stood in the middle of it all without raising his sword or declaring triumph. He made no claim that he had just altered the fate of Europe. He simply looked on, quietly, as if seeing the fragile thread that tied life to sacrifice, and the price every man in that valley had paid to give their homeland one more day of existence. And in that silence, anyone willing to reflect could understand what history never needs to spell out. Strength is not always found in being larger, louder, or greater in number. Sometimes it lies in choosing the right moment to act, and in having the patience to wait for that moment with absolute stillness. Silence is not always a sign of weakness. Silence can be preparation, can be the breath before a decisive strike. Skanderbeg spent 2 years in silence, only to deliver a single answer in Albulena. Great journeys are never free of betrayal. Betrayal is the first test of whether you are strong enough to continue. A trusted hand can become the deadliest blade, but it can also become the reason you forge something sharper than before. And true leadership is not about standing in front to be praised. It is about remaining at the end, in the mud and ash, to ensure that everyone else can take another step forward. Not because the leader is invincible, but because they choose to stay when others have fallen or fled. As the sun rose higher and the mist pulled away from the valley, Skanderbeg looked at the battlefield one last time before riding off. He knew the war was not over. He knew the Ottoman Empire would return. He knew this was only one day in a long lifetime of fighting, yet sometimes one day is enough to alter the fate of an entire land. Albulena has been silent for centuries, but its message remains for anyone who knows how to look at a mist-covered valley and understand that some battles are won not with swords, but with will, patience, and decisions made in the dark. If this story reached you in any way, do not leave empty-handed. Hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. 3 simple actions, but they allow me to keep bringing history back to life, the way you just witnessed.